This is an APH Access Academy webinar. Today's topic, setting the stage for tactile understanding. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Hi, thanks, Leanne. Welcome, everybody. It sounds like we have a really big crowd out there. So thanks for spending your day with us. And today, as Leanne mentioned, we're going to focus on the development of tactile skills needed by students with visual impairments and blindness and how they can successfully interpret them. And basically, as the title says there, set the stage for that understanding. So in terms of who I am, my name is Karen Poppe, and I'm the Tactile Literacy Product Manager at the American Printing House for the Blind. I specialize in the area of tactile literacy products and design materials that are actually used in the classroom by students with visual impairments. Hopefully those tools are also useful to Braille transcribers, teachers, parents as they prepare tactile graphics for their students and children. So some of the tactile training materials I've designed over the years, hopefully you've used them or some of them, and those include Tactile Town, Flip Over concept books, let's see, Sense of Science modules, the Tactile Graphic Line Slate, and Tactile Doodle is one of the more recent products. I've also enjoyed designing like Web Chase, which is a game which I'll show later that kind of nudges the student along in terms of their tactile skill development. I first joined APH back in the mid-1980s, so I witnessed a lot of evolving trends in tactile design, products, methods, and instruction. And when I first started working at APH, most of our graphics were produced through, they were mostly embossed paper graphics, and the majority were without color or print. And as we all know, that element we've tried to introduce with our products now because we want them, one, accessible. We have dual readers out there who benefit from having the tactile and visual together. And we want to encourage shared experiences between the sighted peers and visually impaired students. So that's basically me in a snapshot of where I've been at APH. And I think we have a special guest today that I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint and let Leanne introduce Michael. Okay.
We have a special guest. Mike Hudson is joining us from the museum at APH. Hi, Mike.
Hi, everybody. So I'm coming to you live from the museum storage, where we keep all our treasures here at the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind in Louisville. And what I'm going to share with you today is pretty interesting and pioneering tactile graphic. I'm not sure how well this is coming through on my camera, but what you're seeing is the cover page from a statistical and geographical atlas for the use of the blind on an original plan by Samuel G. Howe, executed at the Institution for the Blind in Boston in 1836. This is the earliest published book of tactile graphics in the Americas. And we're going to turn the page here very gently because this book is quite fragile to expose the map of the United States. The water is created by horizontal lines, and then all that's really picked out is the outline of the United States, the Mississippi River, the Missouri River Valley, the Great Lakes, pretty much the borders between Canada and Mexico and the United States. And I don't know if you can see that, but the border between the United States is drawn much differently than it is today. Of course, lots of things have happened map-wise in the borders of the United States since 1836. But this was the granddaddy of them all, the very first tactile atlas executed in the United States. We're really lucky to have it in our collection here at the museum. And when this COVID thing is over, come by. You'll like to see it.
Thank you so much. Karen, back to you.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can share my screen correctly here. Hopefully I can. Okay. Oh, sorry.
You're doing just fine.
Yes, the top dashboard thing's hiding my, oh, there it is. Okay, sorry. Okay, back and running, I think.
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, really? Okay. Let me try again. Sorry.
It happens.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, what you are sharing is your presentation as if you were building it. There you go.
Need to move it
You can
over a
do
little bit.
current. You can do current slide and just move it down. There you go.
Oh, sorry. Hang in there just a minute. Okay. And from the beginning. For some reason it's being stubborn there. Have any advice?
Do you want me to share?
Sure. Share the PowerPoint.
Mhm.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Not sure why it's not doing it correctly. Okay, go to the objective slide there. Awesome. Okay. So there's 4 objectives today, which we'll cover. Participants will identify at least 10 important tactile skills needed by young students and product materials to support the development of each skill. So I'll have many, many slides on that, as well as more than 10 tactile skills I'll cover. Participants will identify a variety of games and activities that can be used to encourage tactile skill development within a recreational context. Participants will be able to locate the online tactile skills matrix that pairs tactile skills with available APH products. And hopefully you all might be already using that resource, but I'll cover that later in the presentation. And participants will discuss their own creative ways to encourage development of tactile skills. So basically, feel free to, as we go through the presentation, drop in questions or comments or suggestions in the chat box, and Leanne will keep me posted on those. So don't be shy to share your own ideas. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So what I have up here, I just really took that image I had on the front slide of the PowerPoint, and it's a young girl examining a map. And when you look at that, you can tell that she's very proficient Braille reader. And how can we tell? What are the signs? So if you look, she's actively exploring that map of California to glean the information that she needs. And you can actually almost see her thinking through as she examines that map. She's also using a tactile key or legend in combination with a nearby collage or map, which is important. And she's also using both of her hands together, which and seems very deliberate and purposeful in her approach to reading the labels beside the textures in that key and legend. And although it's a complex graphic, the student actually seems to be enjoying the use of the graphic and doesn't look puzzled or intimidated or daunted by it. So you might just even drop in anything else that you might see in that photo that kind of tells you that she's very comfortable reading a tactile graphic. So I'm going to let Leanne launch a poll question, which I'm just curious as to, based on your observations, what is your students' general reaction toward the tactile graphics they received today? Are they mostly frustrated, disinterested, somewhat interested, very interested and motivated, or you're just not certain about how they perceive graphics?
And we'll give you a minute, those using screen readers, to listen to your screen reader.
Somebody
Numbers are
just wrote
still coming in.
overwhelmed. I think I saw overwhelmed come up on somebody's screen.
Don't forget to change your to all panelists and attendees, then we can all share what you're typing in there. Looks like that the poll has mostly ended moving, so I'm going to share those results. 46% someone interested, 30% very interested, motivated, 17 uncertain, and 4% for mostly frustrated or disinterested.
Those are actually encouraging results. I thought there'd be more of the frustrated selections, so that's very encouraging. So students' enthusiasm for these graphics can wane as the graphics become more complex in their school careers. So we really do need to set the stage for understanding and prepare and hone those skills that are going to help them navigate this graphics in their school careers and on standardized tests in particular. And we want them to enjoy the graphics, obviously, and be successful in reading them. So I know I'm speaking to a very knowledgeable audience, but I do want to take just a moment to quickly define tactile graphics. And the definition appears on the screen here. Tactile graphics are raised, embossed images used by Braille readers to obtain information that print readers receive from visual pictures and displays. And those could include maps, graphs, storybook pages. Most tactile graphics and illustrations require some human interaction from a trained artist or a Braille transcriber to make them meaningful and consistent with tactile graphic guidelines presented by BANA. It does take some practice to determine what is the best presentation of the tactile graphic, and it's also very important, if at all possible, if you engage your student in terms of getting their feedback, what works for them and what they don't prefer. So for instance, they might like certain types of textures or a specific type of tactile graphic method. So I know from field testing tactile products, I had that luxury to really put the tactile graphics in the hands of the students, get feedback from both the students and the teachers, and refine those graphics before eventual introduction of the product. So let's move to the next slide, Leanne. So this slide is a lot of verbiage here, but what it does is juxtapose the visual and tactile perception and how are they different. So the touch gathers information in a very sequential fashion. Individual pieces of information provided as raised lines, dots, and textures are connected to build a mental image. So they're essentially gathering that information with their fingertips. Touch requires more time to navigate and glean needed information from a tactile graphic. It does not allow for instant recognition of different perspectives of top view and side view. And touch does not easily discriminate differences in scale and size. Touch does not discriminate spatial relationships that involve depth perception, behind, closer to, away from, with a tactile graphic. And touch relies on labels and supporting text for graphic identification and context. So there's a lot of information there, but I want to convey that in the next slide through an actual example. So next slide, please. Okay. So what you're seeing there on the screen is just a simple outline of a tree and just a very simple side view of a cat. So if we are sighted, we can glance quickly at that image and identify the tree and a cat without any labels at all. As sighted learners, we have been exposed to similar images multiple times and in a variety of ways that allow us to identify what we are looking at in a pretty quick manner, almost instantaneously. We also can perceive depth and notice that the cat is in the foreground and the tree is in the background. For the tactile reader, the cat would only appear next to or beside that tree and slightly lower on the tactile page. The scale of the tree in relationship to the cat can be tactually confusing. Vision paired with our understanding of the size of the tree and cat informs us that we are not looking at a monster-sized cat or that the cat is nearly as big as the tree trunk alone. We need to think about how a tactile reader experiences a tree or a cat. It's not usual that the tactile reader can experience the whole tree at a time or the leaves convert to some cloud-like shape. The cat is shown from a side view, a view that does not necessarily parallel the tactile reader's experience of a cat. And many times tactile renderings such as these are heavily influenced by sighted conventions in experiences and the way we tend to draw them. So the style of a graphic can also make or break it. So a simple raised line image such as these, which I think I pulled both of these from our tactile graphic image library and merged them together. they really lack any texture variation or similarity with the real object. So you really don't feel that canopy or as sort of a single cloud shape for a tree. And if you were to do this as a storybook page, for instance, especially for young children, you would embellish part of that tree with some type of texture that has some conveys that the bark, the rough bark, or a cat, that the fur is what, and the soft fur is what they can denote or connote with the cat. And the labels, of course, are a must. Okay, next page. So let's start with a quick tour of a variety of tactile skills that need to be developed for successful interpretation of tactile graphics. And the very first step, ironically, is not starting with the tactile graphic. We need to expose young children to real objects and allow them to actively explore them, notice the different properties, including the texture and the shape and the temperature, the lines and contours and the salient features that tell them what that object is within a purposeful context. So in these photos, a young child is tracing the sides of a sphere, and that whole object is in her hand, and that her finger is tracing that contour of the ball. It can then be compared, as the lower photo shows, of her tracing with her fingertip a flat disc of that sphere. Next to those pictures is a snapshot of 12 different real objects, and these are real objects that I intentionally chose to include in setting the stage, which is a larger kit for sequentially teaching students how to navigate tactile graphics. And I chose those particular objects because they are commonplace within a young child's experience, and they will be able to maintain one-to-one size correspondence and texture correspondence as we move them through a model and to a raised line drawing. So essentially, start with the real objects, make sure you expand their vocabulary and their experiences, have them compare a real toothbrush and how it compares or differs from maybe those of their families, or how does all the different formats that a spoon is encountered, and actually use scissors and so forth. Okay, next slide. So this shape identification is, a very basic skill. When you think of tactile graphics, those shapes are going to appear in tactile graphics very prominently. So these are just some examples using APH products that you can use to facilitate that learning. So in one case, I took the all-in-one board here, and I mounted the Match It Up frame, which is a 2x5 arrangement. And in the top row, using picture maker pieces, if you have that, I took those shapes, 5 different shapes: circle, oval, rectangle, triangle, and square, and put those in the top row, and then created matching cards, but with an outline shape. And that's just merely taking wiki sticks and making that shape on those cards so that they can just do a really simple matching activity. And next to that is our sorting circles and shapes kit, which is probably the worst name for a product, it's so long, but it does offer a variety of shapes and different textures and sizes and colors, obviously, and allows for even more complex things as Venn diagram construction. So those are 2 products that you can use for shape identification. Next slide, sorry. Okay, and then this is another example of this puzzle board here. It comes from a picture maker accessory kit. The frame itself is a bumpy texture, and then the shapes that they're placing into the frame are sort of a smooth, well, they are a smooth polyblend texture. So that's a very interactive platform to practice those shapes. And adjacent to that photo is just some point symbols, and you'll hear more about point symbols later in this presentation, but those are more consistent with the shapes that kind of shrink in size and appear in tactile graphics to represent landmarks like a state, capital, or specific landmark or a data point on a graph. So that's how, in terms of preparing for shape identification, to kind of move them towards the smaller version of those in anticipation for them encountering those in tactile graphics. And the next slide, please. Okay, so texture discrimination is also important because this too will be something they encounter in tactile graphics in terms of aerial patterns that I'll get into a little bit more later on. So one photo here is just sort of a fanned out display of some of the textures included in carousel textures 1 and 2, a bumpy, rough, smooth, and corrugated. And if you don't use that, those kits are very useful for adapting materials or games or storybooks that you might have at home or in the classroom. Similar to the shape matching activity, taking the all-in-one board, putting a match-it-up frame on that board, and then creating tactile matching cards using the carousel textures materials. And then the student can just move those cards around to align correctly above and below that dividing tactile bar there. Okay, next slide, please. This is a book that was part of a series that APH offers, flip over concept books, and this targets textures, obviously. This is very self-explanatory how to use. There's different adjacent panels, 3 wide, and probably about 10 different textures deep. And the child rotates those panels until he or she locates all of the correct or the same texture across the board. So this one's a little bit more dynamic than some of the other flip over books because I've provided cards that vary even more so, gives you a little bit more options, and the binding can be opened to remove and switch out those cards. One thing that the photo might not be so clear about is whereas some of the textures are formed through vacuum forming on a pretty stiff vinyl, the other cards are more of a flock styrene, which mimics the same textures, but also builds in that soft texture. So it really stretches their minds a little bit to differentiate the slick texture pattern or as opposed to the softer texture. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, line tracking. Again, very important. They're going to have to negotiate tracking different lines within a tactile graph. So in this one image here, it shows 3 different line types, 1, 2, and 3 that overlap. So 1 is a dotted line, 2 is a dashed line, and 3 is a solid line. So they have to track from left to right and navigate all those intertwining intersections of lines as they do so. There's also a flip over book that we offer. Again, there's different line types included in that book, from stair step to wavy to this, what you see here is a upward diagonal line that's made up of a dotted line. So a lot of those lines that are encountered in that book mimic similar lines that they will encounter in tactile graphics, whether it's dashed or dotted or sort of a directional line. And one thing we did include, which I don't have showcased here, but based on field evaluation, they wanted some worksheets, some tracking worksheets that show each of those lines in one continuous format before we do the dissection across the 3 panels. So that's also, that complements that book as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is something you can I'm just giving an example how you can take like the all-in-one board, just pull together some some magnetic strips, and then just alternated having star shapes at the end or beginning of each line. So they will have to go left to right, top to bottom as they move down that path. So just think of ways you can use some of our tools or even things that you might create on your own to encourage that line tracking skill. Okay, next slide. Okay, that kind of blends right into systematic scanning. So I actually copied that one photo with the hands moving left to right and up and down from the Tactile Graphics kit that was developed back, I believe, in the late 70s by John Barth. So they were illustrating how it's important for There's really not a right or wrong to systematic scanning. It's just finding a dependable approach that prevents a child from missing anything on the page, kind of getting an overall glimpse through their fingertips of what they might encounter on that page. Am I about to look at a graph or a map or just an illustration of something? So, and then the other image, I'm just showing how often it's important to keep one finger as a reference point, a returning reference point, as you trace along a larger shape. So again, no right or wrong, but they do need to develop some type of just some approach that works for them and as they explore a tactile graphic. And the next slide, spatial understanding. Lots of available materials to reinforce a variety of skills here. To the farthest left here is an image using picture maker pieces. And those concepts include where I have a triangle inside a square or outside a square, or a circle above or below a triangle, or how many rectangles above or below a dividing bar. Now, this is an interesting concept because you think, oh, on top of is always as it's displayed here, but on top of could actually be if the child takes that circle and then places literally on top of the triangle. So there's some spatial skills there that can be tricky if you don't intentionally teach all the different ways that that concept can be experienced. The next worksheet there is from Tactile Treasures. Tactile Treasures really tries to provide high relief graphics that are easier for a young child to really grasp and with their hands and to feel versus just a simple raised line drawing or something. So in this case, you have rings above a bracelet and you could test something like find the ring inside the bracelet or above or below. And then there's some bold dots or circles on top of an elevated platform, rectangle, or around it. And so those are some, and I think the next slide eventually will show you the whole setting the stage kit. Another photo here is taken from parts of Tactile Town, and I've built a compass rose, and you can get some pretend play situations in there where I've put a house to illustrate northeast, south, and west with names and just sort of a pretend situation where you can take maybe the pedestrian and walk them around the lake in certain directions, clockwise, counterclockwise, finding who lives nearest another person. And then the last image there is, unfortunately, that is a worksheet from an obsoleted product that it was called IntelliTactile's Pre-Braille Concepts. But it also shows how raised platform shapes are a little bit easier to negotiate by visually impaired students. So you could get into a lot of spatial skills there, like find the shape that's below an oval or above a star. Those are things that you could just take and recreate on your own. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and as I promised, that's just sort of a snapshot of the updated Tactile Treasures kit. When I first introduced that back in 1997, it was sans color. It didn't have any color to the pages. It was also, the pages were more fragile and easily damaged. So in terms of a modernization, I increased the thickness of those pages so kids could be a little bit more rough and while they're exploring it and not damage them. Also integrating the color with the pages to make them more inviting to, obviously if you're working in tandem with a sighted student or for low vision students who may need that visual aspect to kind of confirm what they're feeling tactually. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, there you go. Symbolic understanding is what it sounds like. It's understanding that something, a drawing or an image, is representative of something real in the world. So this is another flip over book where they essentially match the left and right halves of a whole object. But I have the guidebook open to the page where it emphasizes that they really should look at a real leaf, a real apple, a real cup in combination with that tactile representation and understand that it can't fully capture all the salient features that they might recognize in the real object when you move to the tactile counterpart. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this I took a storybook. This is a storybook by Suzette Wright, who's one of my colleagues, and she's done a lot in terms of storybook development, tactile books. And this is called Jennifer's Messes. And I took that page that shows an arrangement of those were vacuum formed images of cereal, a pretzel, a broken crayon, and a broken barrette. And I mimicked those using, well, those are cards from Tactile Connections. They're also included with the matching frames, but I took the real objects and adhered those to the cards so that there's real Cheerios, a real pretzel, crayon broken in half, and a barrette broken in half, and actually mimic that same arrangement as what's on the page. So you can find opportunities to bring that real object into play when reading aloud a tactile book. Okay, next page, please. Okay, symbolic understanding again. These are just a variety of ways a house might be explored, from a miniature to an actual model, a 3D model, and that's from setting the stage, and we'll review that later, to simple raised line outline, which I pulled that in from the Tactile Graphic Image Library. And then I have the tactile railroad strip that's included in Tactile Town, and just put that adjacent to a photo of a railroad track. And there are some similarities to that with the raised crossbars. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I've been talking about setting the stage, and this slide actually shows the whole kit. And then it also highlights how you want to navigate the child from the real object, in this case, the toothbrush, to a model. And then the middle tray compartment there shows a vacuum or thermoformed image of the toothbrush. This stage, my observation during field testing, was usually a young child, 4 years old, can usually identify that representation pretty readily and pretty confidently, because as you can see, the bristles are still tactually available and they can grasp that handle of the toothbrush. But what becomes more challenging is when they go to that third stage, that third compartment, and that's more comparable to a lot of tactile graphics are going to encounter down the road, is merely a raised line image of that toothbrush. So within that kit, if we go, well, we don't have to go back to that first slide, but where I showed that collection of 12 objects that's in that kit, it walks them through that similar transition for the ball and the cup and the scissors and the zipper, so forth. So I'm not sure if anyone is using that kit. It's getting to be kind of old, maybe at a time where I need to modernize it, but it's probably our strongest product in terms of just starting with the basics of how something is symbolic of a real object in terms of a tactile graphic. And you can go ahead to the next slide, please, Leanne. So to jumpstart their understanding, here I have a real apple next to, and I took, if you know what the drawing film is from Tactile Doodle or the Draftsman, you can take the outline stencil there and have the student actually participate in either freehand drawing their own image of an apple or tracing within that style or stencil. And in that discussion, when they're doing that, to try to highlight what is forfeited. You know, the contour of the apple is lost, maybe obviously the texture, and the stem maybe it's just now a little simple raised line versus something they can grab onto when they're looking at the real apple. Okay, next slide, please. I took the old giant textured beads that we offered for many years and provided pattern matching cards. Now they come in a variety. They're either actual duplicates where they duplicate the texture and the shape as in that tray presented there underneath the giant textured beads. and the child can pair the the actual geometric shape, whether it's a rectangular prism or cube or a cylinder, with that duplicate tactile version. And then I don't have them highlighted here, but there's actually some cards that are, they dismiss the color and the texture, and it's merely the raised shape that they can pair with the real geometric item. And then the other image here that I do show is the more complicated 3D views of those same geometric shapes. So where you get into hidden lines and sort of things shown at an oblique angle. So just know that that's available to you. And the next slide. Okay, kind of walk through the same transition from here's a cul-de-sac built with tactile town pieces, where that affords a play or pretend situation where they can move the cars within the cul-de-sac, encounter 3D yield signs and stop signs and 3D houses, and then moves them more into an abstract representation via the picture maker pieces, where I closely try to mimic that same outline, keeping the dashed row lines, and then the sort of the square, they're felt squares that represent the houses and so forth. And then the last step there is a raised outline, flat outline of a cul-de-sac, and that is taken directly from our tactile graphic image library. So again, just highlighting the sequence. Understanding perspective. I have here the cup from tactile setting the stage next to the tactile image of the side view of the cup. So what's interesting here is I wanted to point out that, again, that our drawings can be tainted or heavily influenced by how we visually perceive an object. So this, if you ask most people to draw a cup, this is probably what they'll generate. But in field testing of setting the stage, it was interesting to encounter a student identifying that raised circle for the cup, because that is their experience. They're experiencing the open top view of the cup or the rim. So that's just a really good example of how we may draw things in ways that don't really relate directly with their own tactile experience. Okay, next slide, please. These are a couple of tactile graphics included. The first one I've included in sense of science, astronomy, and it gives a cross section of the sun. And versus, you would never want to show this at an oblique view or some complex vantage point. So it's more just sort of like a slice so that of the sun, where you can label each layer. Now, what I did have to change when I field tested this is, whereas I had only the upper part of that cross-section labeled, corona and so forth, they also wanted those labels repeated, so that, say, if the student was tracing that line all the way around that semicircle, they could go from the lead line that points to the identifying Braille print label and then end up at that same identifying label, if that makes sense. I do take some opportunity in the sense of science modules to really push to show things in different perspectives, such as that turtle. It really doesn't illustrate the final product because the turtle is a very collage, the shell is very convex, I guess, and has incised lines for each of the divisions of the upper turtle shell. But that is shown from both the top view and side view to get that vocabulary introduced early on to students. And next slide, please. This is the tactile house included with setting the stage, and this was to really emphasize perspectives related to top view, side view, and like the back view of the house. So what that does, it takes the house captures real life equivalent things like stone, the tin roof, the brick chimney, and captures those in more of a flat two-dimensional way onto matching cards. So those cards that are provided, the students will have to go through and identify, is that a correct view that matches the house or not? Whereas there are correct views, there's incorrect views that differ maybe in a textural change or some type of positional change. Maybe the window hopped onto the other side of the house or the texture has changed. So that's really helpful for even older students who sort of struggle with the perspective taking of a graphic. And the next slide, please. This is showing different cubes, views of cubes. So one of our products that we have currently, I'm not sure how long it's going to be around, is Stack Ups. And what that does, it offers actual Velcro cubes. The top of the cube is rough, or the hook side, and then the blue or the sides of the cube are soft, or the loop material. So it allows them to connect those cubes to mimic two-dimensional drawings, which I show here in the collection of Stack Up components. Also interesting on that, I learned in field testing that mat plans are very helpful. They serve as sort of a blueprint on how to build those 3D structures. So it will give a number of cubes in each quadrant or section, and they can use that to build those two-dimensional cubes, or I'm sorry, 3D cube stacks. And then, oh yeah, go ahead. Okay, so another important skill is the familiarity with tactile terminology. So you've already encountered that in this presentation. Everything from line paths to point symbols. Point symbols, again, are those things that are going to take on the highest elevation in a tactile graphic and usually represent a specific landmark, easily to detect with the fingertip. And the textures and aerial patterns are used for water or some type of large region, or maybe part of a bar graph, or sort of a colored in area of a fraction or a pie chart that we'll see later. And then labels, of course, that are just critical to making graphics as meaningful as possible. Okay, next slide. And here I want to pause for a poll question, and I think Leanne has that available to you. I want to ask you about what type of tactile graphic methods do your students encounter most? And the options there are collage, microcapsule, thermoform, vacuum formed, embossed paper graphics, or hybrid. Maybe you're using a hybrid. Maybe you take embossed paper graphics or a grid and you embellish them with some collage paper. The drawing film is used in Draftsman or tactile doodle boards, something else, or you're just not certain what type of methods are being used.
And we'll give a minute to get those come in. You have 15 minutes left to give you an idea, Karen.
Yeah, thanks. The rest of the slides go pretty quickly.
And the numbers are still coming in. While those are coming in, you had one person say that they use the tools for upper level students who are in computer aided design courses where they have to understand perspectives. Okay, they've stopped coming in. In the interest of time, I'm going to end the poll, share the results. Our top 30% is embossed paper graphics. Next is hybrid graphics, then thermoform, and then small amounts of the other.
It's really encouraging. I like seeing that there's a lot of hybrid options being used. So what I have here is just a smattering of different options that are available just to define those for you. Like the seedling as a collage, as well as the little bumblebee there that's made out of carousel textures materials. We also have the different assortment of leaves as a microcapsule rendition. The leaves from Sense of Science plants are vacuum formed and they're transparent so that you can use them on a light box. The circumpolar dome showing different constellations, that is also a vacuum formed part from our production area at APH. The grid showing the lines that go back and forth diagonally, that is a Roland UV printed master, and that is more commonplace now at APH. It really helps us to streamline tactile graphic production and get tactile graphics into your hands faster. And then the map below is just merely one I think I took from the tactile graphics kit. So lots of it's a proliferation of different tactile methods these days, and I'm just really glad to hear that you're using a mixture of those. Reading tactile graphs and charts and graphs, I just have here a fraction pie chart, and it does show, here's an example of where you want to use a texture that's a low profile within the surrounding lines that so the bumpy texture is at a lower elevation than the dividing lines of that pie chart. The Venn diagrams and the different textures applied to a graph or chart. Okay, next slide, please. And okay, and then reading tactile maps, just again, just a variety of maps from everything from O&M, either on Picture Maker or just vacuum formed representations to more complicated US map there. And then that last picture is a two-dimensional drawing. I'm working on a product right now called Room with a View, where I have 3D objects that they can build different room arrangements, whether it's a classroom or a kitchen or an office or a library. So that's something I'm working on now. And next slide, please. Okay, reading keys and legends. This science poster allows students to build their own key of the different skeletal bones, the anterior view of the human skeleton. So that is available for your use. And next slide. Sorry, I'm going to speed through some of the other ones here. Okay, and here's one I wanted to get to, and I have a poll question related to this one too. And Leanne can launch that, but I'm just interested, do your students actively participate in the creation of their own tactile graphic design? Yes, no, or uncertain?
Those are rolling in.
Okay.
And they've really trickled. Thanks for answering. And we have, right now, it's about 63% no and 28% yes.
Hopefully I can give you some ideas on how to encourage that, because that's something we're trying to do more so in our products that we introduce, is to give students the tools to create their own graphics. So let me just give you some options here. We have the quick draw paper, which is more or less, it's not really paper, it's compressed sponge. So anything that's a water-based tool or drawing stylus, like a marker, you know, something you can get off the shelves at a store. As soon as that moisture from the pen hits that paper, it swells, so you get that instantaneous picture that raises. The sailboat there is colored using the color by texture marking mats, which I have shown there. So that provides different really durable plates that you drop into a sturdy tray. You put the coloring page on top of whatever texture the child prefers, and they take their crayon and they rake across that texture. You can maximize an available number of textures by merely flipping the plates over, so you might get a slightly different texture depending on how you rub on the top of the plate versus the other side of the plate, the reverse side. And then there's some coloring pages there for you to use. And next slide. And then the tactile graphic line slate, which really is very intuitive for students, as I learned in field testing, because it mimics a Braille slate and stylus, and they can draw their own lines, dotted, dashed, a railroad track, a solid line, and a narrow line. And then Tactile Doodle is one of our more recently introduced products, where it takes tactile drawing film. You clamp it into those outer brackets there. And when you draw with, there's a special tool that we've designed that's a little bit easier for younger students to handle. And it's a non-roll stylus. And as you draw on that film, it raises instantly, and it gives more of a visual contrast between the drawing, which is white, against the black background. So very easy and intuitive for children to use. And next slide, please. Okay, I'm just going to go through some really quick games, as I promised, that you can just get some ideas about or mimic. So the game example for building tactile skills here is to just take some picture maker strips and shapes and create your own little maze for the student to, I mean, you can think of all the different concepts you can introduce just by this image of spatial concepts, shape recognition, moving in a very deliberate fashion in terms of exploratory skills, top to bottom, left to right, making sure they don't miss anything. And then the next slide, please. Okay, is I took picture maker pieces and all on one board, and I made a dividing strip there, and you can create any type of find the differences. So in this case, it's just a whimsical face, and there to find that the eyebrows are different and the earrings are a little different on the ears, and the nose is in a different position, an upward triangle versus a downward triangle, and a frown versus a smile. So just get creative and have some fun with those. Okay, the next game I did. This is one that's already established for you, Web Chase. It's been around for a while, but this one was intentionally designed to teach tactile skills. So you have prey pieces that are both shape or texture. The student has to, the players have to navigate across those dotted web strands or solid spokes. And they have the lunch trays that serve as a key or legend as they collect their game pieces on that board. So keep that in mind. I know it's getting kind of old, but it's still very inviting to all students to use. Okay, and the next, this, how many six-legged critters are there? I had produced a lot of tactile activity magazines within a series called Squid, but those have had to be obsoleted because they weren't UEB compliant. So I'm just giving you some examples that you can create on your own, but essentially they would search that page and find all the six-legged critters. And then the other page, it's hard to tell on this one, but I took a soft circle from the picture maker and hid that within an array of smooth circle dots so that they can search for the hidden pink, well, in this case, soft for the tactile reader dot. So use those tools to create some fun games. Next slide, please. Games of Squares is an established game that you can take to play conventional games like checkers. Just give an example of one I made up for Zigzag, where it really pushes the child to move left to right and avoid obstacles, which are represented by those red squares inserted into the grid. And then the finish box, as they go left to right, top to bottom, the finish box is in that lower left-hand corner. So you can use that whole game for a variety of games. So look into that. And the next slide, please. You can take, be creative with like using the tactile cards from setting the stage, flipping them over to create puzzle frames, and then having the child insert the real object into that incised area as a puzzle. You can also take wiki sticks, and I have this in setting the stage, but you can take those and have the child trace around the real object shape. It's really interesting how you can take that wiki stick, wrap it around the ball, and just gently take that off and lay it flat as a circle so that they understand, oh, that's why they draw a ball as a circle, is because of the way that is wrapped around it and then removed and then placed onto a flat surface. And so same thing with the cube. And the next slide, thanks, Leanne, is tactile tangrams. And that has some solution pages with the outlines of the shapes, and the child can just merely match those shapes within the puzzles. Okay, next slide, please. These are some fun activities for art. So taking those colored by texture plates that I showed you earlier, take some clay or Play-Doh and press those into those plates to transfer the texture. You can use the coloring pages onto a light box and place the coloring mat on the light box, which is those are translucent, and then have this child rub on top of that texture to transfer the texture. Create some greeting cards, and there's some really cool greeting cards in our tactile image library. You can take some aluminum diagramming foil, place those on top of the color matching, color by matching plates, and then transfer, like in this case, the zigzag texture into the aluminum foil. And the next slide, please. And then just in summary, I just took all those different skills that I just went through and just put them around the picture of the child that we earlier looked at reviewing the map. So just in a quick summary, those skills included exploration of real objects, shape recognition, texture, discrimination, line tracking, scanning techniques, understanding spatial concepts, symbolic understanding, 3D to 2D interpretation, understanding perspective, familiarity with tactile terminology, experience with various tactile methods, reading graphs and charts, reading maps, reading keys and legends, and creating graphs. So that's quite a bit, but so look at opportunities to reinforce those skills. And next slide, please. And then here's the shortcut or the link to the tactile skills matrix that I maintain. I take all of those tactile skills, and if you click on any of those skills within the matrix, it will lead you to a whole page of supporting tactile products that APH offers. I've maintained reference to those that might have been obsoleted just in case you have those out in the field somewhere. So even if they have been obsoleted, I wanted to keep reference to those. And the next slide, please. We have 1 minute, and I wanted to make sure I put in a link here to the BANA guidelines for transcription of early educational materials from print to braille that gives you some good tips and strategies and guidelines for creating tactile graphics for young students. And the next slide. Okay, and I've referred many times to APH's Tactile Graphic Image Library. Lots of coloring pages in there, some games in there, and just some basic outlines that you might want to use. And I believe we have a webinar coming up on the 27th that Leanne could probably reinforce that. I think that's the correct date. So that wraps up my presentation. We might have a few minutes for some questions or comments. And if not, you can feel free to email me at that email address at kpoppe, kpoppe@aph.org with any of your comments or suggestions, or if you're interested in field testing, anything that you're interested in regard to tactile graphics. Thank you for your time, and thanks, Leanne.